Hello, my name is Vanessa de Oliveira Andreotti. I am a professor at the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, in Canada. And I'm also a Canada Research Chair in Race, Inequalities, and Global Change. I'm speaking today from Calgary, the territory of the Blackfoot people. It's Treaty 7 territory. I would like to thank you all for inviting me to start this conversation today, and especially Justine, who I met in a Deep Adaptation residency last month. So I have 6 questions that were posed to me. I will try my best to respond to them in the time that we have. And the first one is about my background and why I do the work that I do. So I think I cannot separate the work that I do from my personal life. And I was born in Brazil in a mixed heritage family, where my dad, back in the 70s, was opposing some Brazilian policies, agrarian expansion policies that were killing indigenous people. And his brothers were actually involved in this agrarian expansion movement, and he wanted to make a stand about that. And his way of making a stand was actually to want to marry an indigenous person, and my mom, in order to help them develop and become more civilized, and also to whiten the genetic stock. So I was born in a context of colonialism where somebody, my dad, was trying to change the world in a very progressive way, but also a very racist way. So very problematic. So it is a paradox, right? So I grew up in that environment, trying to figure out this relationship between cultures in dissonance. And it has taught me a lot. It was not easy. It was actually quite painful to observe and to be a witness to this, but also to be the product of this attempt to change the world. So I also have lived in many different countries as I started my academic journey. So I actually did my PhD and my master's in the UK at the Universities of Nottingham and Manchester, where as an immigrant, I worked from cleaning toilets to teaching at the university. And in that period, that's when I started working with NGOs in the UK, development education centers, looking at global citizenship education projects, both in terms of the assumptions that were involved in these projects, but also trying to propose alternative practices that could address some of the problems that I identified at the time. So one of the things that I was working on at the time was how enduring this single story of progress, development, and human evolution is, how difficult it is to interrupt it, and how it affects North-South engagements. So when schools, for example, want to help other schools in the Global South, what are the patterns of engagements and relationships that keep repeating? So one of the things that I did was to offer a framework for us to identify some of these problematic patterns. The framework is called Heads Up, and each letter stands for a problematic pattern of engagement and representation. So the first one is that these engagements are usually hegemonic. They present a single story of progress, development, and human evolution as the only story, and it's the story of weight. E stands for ethnocentric, the universalization of one view of the world as the universal view. A stands for ahistorical. We don't understand, we don't engage with the history of relationships between the communities, especially the history of colonialism. D is depoliticized. We don't engage with uneven power relations and the impact it has on the relationship. is that these engagements are usually self-serving, self-congratulatory, and salvationist, wanting to save other people, but without checking the assumptions of this savior disposition. Going back to what my dad did to my mom, for example. And U stands for uncomplicated solutions, and P is paternalism. So engaging with marginalized communities, wanting a thank you back, but also in ways that infantilize this community. So in the area of global citizenship and international development education, people have started to use this framework to try to interrupt these patterns. But I'm also interested in how difficult it is, because the funding structures, the ways that Western institutions and non-Western institutions as well, how institutions operate, mitigate against this kinds of interruptions. So that's part of the work that I do in this area. And global citizenship, in the area of global citizenship, we're working at the interface of questions of climate change, sustainability, migration, racialization, colonialism, and many other issues that are now surfacing, even mental health, right? So we are looking at multiple unprecedented local and global challenges that we have to face together. Another part of my work is at the interface between indigenous and non-indigenous communities. So in that sense, I also worked both in New Zealand with Maori communities. Actually, part of my family is now Maori. In Finland, both with the Sami people, but also coordinating a master's program for teachers on critical intercultural education. And now I am working in Canada, where a lot of my research is related to indigenous communities in Brazil, in Mexico, and in Canada, and how efforts to decolonize or indigenize or include diversity tend to reproduce certain problematic patterns. So my work is about problematic patterns and how, by learning from these repeated issues and mistakes, we could perhaps make only different mistakes in the future. So I think in relation to the first question that was posed about what does it mean for individuals to take responsibility for the harm that our Western lifestyles are creating, what I've learned so far is that it is really important to develop the stamina to sit with the complexities and complicities that we are all involved in. So we know that the systems that create the positions where we speak from are violent and are unsustainable. And the desire for either exiting the system and arriving at a pure space, or a space where you're not complicit, is actually part of the problem. And in the same way that shame, guilt, are also not generative responses to this. So we have to find another way between either the exit strategy or the beating yourself up strategy. And what I have been experimenting with the collective that I work with, which is a collective of artists and researchers, is a position where we sit with our own internal complexity and learn to do that, to sit with a bus of people that we have inside of us, and the fact that this bus can contain the whole humanity, in order to be able to sit with the complexity outside and learn to show up very differently in the world. And this showing up differently requires us to compost our own individual shit so that we can show up in order to be able to compost the collective, systemic, historical shit together. So unless we find a different way of being, we won't be able to sit together to do this work. So we generally say that the problems we are facing are not informational problems. It's not about just more knowledge. They are a problem. They are problems related to a harmful habit of being that has been normalized and naturalized for a long time, but more specifically in the last 500 years through processes of colonization, colonialism. So, what does it mean to identify our colonial habits of being and want to interrupt them? Because the problem is that these colonial habits of being are actually quite pleasurable, and we say that they are delicious. So how can we design interventions or education that invites people to rearrange these desires uncoercively? We also make a very, very important distinction between changing thinking, which is one thing. It's like if it's education is about just giving information because we see the problem as a problem of ignorance. By presenting information, we would solve the problem. And when we deal with questions of unsustainability and systemic violence, this is not the case. So we frame the problem as a problem of denial. And when we talk about denial, we have to talk about the unconscious, which is not just about what we think and what we say, but everything that is underneath it, right? Which is also related to our traumas, problematic aspirations, how we are invested in the system, the oppressive system, all of that. And in that sense, we talk about the systems that we operate in being based on 4 denials. So the first is the denial of violence, the denial of the fact that for us to have what we have, this is based on destitution, dispossession, and genocide somewhere else. The second thing is the denial of unsustainability, the fact that the planet has limits and we are already at those limits. So we will have to face the end of the world as we know it, and that's how we connect with the Deep Adaptation movement. The third denial is the denial of entanglement, the idea that we're separate from each other, the illusion that we're separate from each other, and the denial that we're part of a bigger, larger metabolism that is the planet and beyond, and that as being part of this metabolism, we don't have just the temporality of this body, we have longer temporalities, we have kin in the plants, in the other animals, in the soil, in the atmosphere, and everything in between. And that entails enormous responsibilities. So this idea of separation as a constitutive trauma that we carry. And the last denial is the denial of the magnitude of the problem. So especially now that people are waking up to the potential extinction, what we see is a lot of band-aid solutions, right? So simplistic solutions that tend to use up a lot of energy and resources, but keep us walking in circles. So the denial of the magnitude of the problem is this aspiration to move forward without digging deeper first, to understand where we're at, so that we can find or figure out a different way of existing together. So back to the question, what does it mean to exist in that space with all these denials and all these complexities? We say that the first step is to develop the stamina to dig deeper and relate wider, which means that you need to disidentify with some pleasurable things and renounce them. And especially on the part of people who haven't been through high intensity struggle, we say that people in the West are people in low intensity struggle, realizing that this privilege also created a lot of fragilities and weaknesses, and often also an infantilized way of dealing with things, where we want things on our terms, where we want to move forward and we want to do it quick. We want to feel good, do good, look good. And this is actually a barrier to us really facing the amount of individual and collective shit that there is for us to compost, and the responsibility to show up differently. So the first step, I think, is to identify the denials, both within and outside of us, and how we are enmeshed in this. Understand that this is going to be a messy, difficult, painful, complex, and complicated process, and be up for the task, right? And show up. And understand that if you don't show up generatively to this, you are stealing space and resources, and therefore taking responsibility for your own process and the processing of your own shit, so that when we sit with the collective shit together, you can be at the best space you can be to support what is in the center, which is the planet, right? So it's not a group of people, it is the whole planet. So that's partly what is necessary, I think, and we need we need support. Basically, we need support to do that, because neurobiologically, the system that we have has hooked us in certain addictions. So it's much better to think about this in terms of addictions rather than moral arguments or convictions, because then we can bring in what is unconscious to the conversation. So think about the difficulties of interrupting an addiction. That's the level of difficulty that we have in interrupting harmful colonial patterns of being that are now making our metabolism very sick, and that are jeopardizing our own survival in the planet. So the second question, I think all the questions will go back to this one. So I think the next ones are going to be quicker. How can people in the West stand in solidarity with those already experiencing climate-related collapse or hardship? As mentioned before, the first thing is to shed your arrogance and to shed the desire to feel good, to do good, and to look good, and try to be useful in the ways that are required, right? So this is a form of responsibility that is not so much related to a conviction. It needs to be visceral, because if it is an intellectual choice or based on your values or something like that, it's always it's always a choice. So in a choice based on convenience, right? So if it's convenient, then you do it. If it's not convenient, you don't. We need to get to a space where it doesn't matter if it's convenient or not, if you're going to look ridiculous or not, if it's going to risk some of your privileges or not. We will need people to show up differently to this kind of work. And part of this work is to really understand deeply the effects of violence, of systemic and historical violence on the bodies of people, on the amount of labor people have to do, even for your own learning, to understand how diverse bodies and non-normative bodies are often instrumentalized for the agendas that are on the table. And that there's a lot of invisibilized labor that goes on that is not recognized. So you would need to do your homework and understand all that, and how painful, harmful it is to inhabit and bear the brunt of this violence, so that you can see the other person not as somebody you're going to help, but as part of you, right? So what this whole violence is also in your body. We are interwoven with each other, and unless you feel that pain, basically, it's going to be difficult for you to feel this visceral responsibility to show up differently. But most people don't want to feel the pain. Most people want to feel good, do good, look good. So first thing to interrupt is this desire to feel, look, and do good, which is based basically on a colonial on the colonial trauma of separation, right? So if you're separated from the land, from the cosmos, when you're separated from the other animals, from the plants, from each other, we don't feel, like even neurobiologically, that we have intrinsic value. So we have to keep producing value. And then we have the distinction between good people and bad people, the human and the inhuman, rather than the idea that there's no good team, bad team. It's one boat. And this boat is going down, and we will have to figure out either how to, I think fixing the boat is what most people want, but maybe the task just requires us to learn to breathe water, which is a very different way of being. And it may be impossible, right? In which case we need to find ways of dying well together as we face our extinction. So I think that is already related to the next question about how can we build climate justice into the deep adaptation movement and its foundations. It's interesting because a lot of people also have this desire for checklists. So you do this, that, and the other, and then you're off the hook. There's nothing like that. Climate justice and standing in solidarity with people require being open to do the work that is needed, not the work that you want to do. And it's not about self-realization. It's not about being innocent. It's not about redemption. It is about understanding that reconciliation will require a lot of painful work. And at one layer, yes, we are all one. We're one with each other and with the stars and with the whales and with the flowers, but we're also one with the shit that needs to be composted so that it becomes new soil for the relationships, for new relationships and new possibilities of existence to be possible, right? And a lot of people want to be one just in the way of what is pleasurable about it, and they forget that there's this other work to be done, right? And again, as I said, this is not about beating yourself up, a guilt trip, or shaming. It's nothing to do with that, although we recognize that in other layers of our existence, shame has been mobilized to get people to understand that they have to redistribute resources, for example. So it is about understanding that there are different layers of this work. And in some layers, we have to use different discourses just to mobilize the possibility of us working together. So the layering of things and the ability to hold the complexity of these different layers and how they are contradictory often between themselves is also part of the process, right? And doing it in a good way, in a generative space, without tantrums and hissy fits that take up the energy, steal the energy in the spaces that we could be working together. So climate justice is about understanding the impact and the magnitude of the problem, and not wanting to do that as a tokenistic gesture so that we can move forward together quickly. It is about the disposition and willingness to dig deeper and sit with painful and difficult things together without relationships falling apart. And as I said before, we need help with that. We don't know how to do that. We're not socialized into that. Indigenous groups that I've worked with have some practices that can help, including entheogenic practices that help us deal with our own shit without having, like in the West, we have only narrative ways of processing trauma and insecurities and fears. whereas in communities that still have this sense of entanglement, they process it in very different ways. They process it through the body. They have dreaming practices that help process stuff. So they have practices that recalibrate our vital compass so that we can face what we have to face together in a generative space. So for my work and the work of my collective, this has been a priority, getting us into a generative space so that we can face the complexities and the difficulties without being, without allowing us, without allowing what triggers us to block the process, right? So it's a lot of internal work that needs to be done so that our shit can be processed, and this visceral responsibility to sit with everybody to to face the collective shit. The next question is, how can those of us with the privilege of being able to prepare mentally and spiritually for collapse and hardship use that time well in service of the whole humanity and life? I think we've been talking about it in terms of looking at, there's, I think, from my perspective, there is an industry of self-care, and that's as collapse starts or has started. And it's important to remember in relation to the previous question that we are experiencing collapse now here in the West and in the global North, but collapse has already happened for many other people, right? So we talk about this metaphor of a flood. We have the saying in Brazil that in a flood situation, it's only when the water reaches your hips or your bum that you can actually swim. Before that, you can only walk. So as you are preparing for the waters rising, learn from the swimmers. I'm not saying learn how to swim from the swimmers, but engage with the swimmers, the people who are already facing collapse, who are in high intensity struggle. Don't go there to try to instrumentalize and consume what they have for your own benefit, but go there to remember that your body can swim and to humble yourself to the fact that you are also responsible for the water, right, rising. And your privileges have come from the water rising for other people. So use your time wisely by recognizing the magnitude of the problem, by recognizing that we are entangled, by recognizing that the system has been extremely violent towards different communities. And as collapse accelerates, these are the communities that are going to pay the price first. So there's climate racism, there's the far-right backlash right now that is probably only going to intensify. This is one of the concerns of Jem Bendals as well, about the far-right appropriating the discourse of collapse to say, okay, we will save only those who deserve to be saved, and these are white Christian, the white Christian demographic. And these conferences are already there. They have started. Populist governments are actually fueling this. What happened in Brazil, for example, in relation to the last elections, was that the left was not acknowledging the possibility of collapse. They were saying just like, we're on this boat and it's a bit kind of unstable, but if we all hold hands and stay together, we can stabilize it, right? Whereas Bolsonaro came and said, the boat is going down, we need to get rid of the dead weights, just throw overboard the bodies of indigenous people, black people, gay people, and they're going to be fine. We're going to keep going up the stairs to the upper decks where we will find the life-saving boats. The life-saving boats are all damaged as well. So that's a different conversation that we need to have about that. But the acknowledgement of collapse is very much open to the weaponization. So the far right can weaponize it and make the lives of these diverse non-normative communities much more difficult than they already are. So part of the role of people who recognize this problem is to shield, right? To shield and redistribute things as needed, right? I'm not talking about redistributing opportunities or access to the boat. I often say at the university that I feel like I'm selling tickets to the Titanic when I'm talking about helping diverse people with social mobility, right? Right now, social mobility is not what we should be working with. We should be working together. We should be centering the land. We should be recognizing the labor and the pain that has been inflicted on different bodies, and how we tend to consume and instrumentalize them so that we can show up differently. The example that we use about showing up differently, I will use it here. It sounds a little bit banal, but there's a point to that, so bear with me. So the image I'm going to evoke is the image of that actually happened. We were in Peru. There was this very busy road between where we were and where we were going to go, the center on the other side, where there was a gathering, and there were 10 of us on one side. And as we were waiting to cross the street, this very little dog was still a puppy, decided to cross, right? And it was really interesting to see the response of the group to that. So some people just closed their eyes, other people screamed, a lot of people froze, and one person went to the middle of the road and stopped the traffic. And it was not done as I'm gonna do this. It was not a calculation. It was not a thinking thing. It was just the person went and did it. And the traffic stopped, the dog passed, the person just went there and petted the dog and just went on doing what she was going to do anyway, and then didn't remember that she had done it. So I use this example to show that as collapse arrives, we're going to have to stop traffic. And this cannot be a calculation. This cannot be a courageous movement that you're going to receive a badge of honor or award for. It will have to be what is normal, what normalized, that we learn to stop. Patterns, right? We learn to stop the traffic. And this will require some risk, or maybe a lot of risk, right? And that will be different in different situations. But it has to be a visceral responsibility. You won't have time to think. You have to put yourself in a position where you're not going to be just closing your eyes or screaming or freezing. You will have to put yourself in the middle of traffic and stop the traffic, right? So that kind of disposition is what we need if we're going to bring climate justice to the conversation. We will need people to not be fragile and not ask to be rescued because they just can't take the pain or the difficulties or the complexities, that they just want to move forward because this is an infantilized position. We will all need to grow up, and we need to grow up together, and that requires renouncing some of the pleasures that we're used to for the possibility of finding new joys and new forms of well-being through the pain, through the struggle, through the difficulties, right? And committing to that in a visceral way. So the last question was about a new paradigm, whether there was a new paradigm and how should we engage with that paradigm while knowing that we may be unlikely to see it come alive in our lifetime. I think when we talk about paradigms, it's generally a frame of thinking, right, that we can live by. And the communities I work with are not about grounding their existence or their security in thinking or in meaning. It's not about that. It is about this visceral responsibility for the miracle of life, right? And it starts with your own, and understanding, clearing the space for you to sense your own the intrinsic value of your own life, and that this life is connected with all life, and not just the lifetime of a body. It's connected to life of the metabolism itself. So once we take responsibility for that, this is not a paradigm. It is a different way of being, of existing, that doesn't require you to profess it to other people, but just to stop the traffic when when it's necessary, and not make it a big deal. That's just what you do, right? So I think in terms of a checklist, if I have to give you one, we talk in our projects about decentering, disarming, decluttering, and discerning, right? So the part of the pathway towards recalibrating ourselves and learning to show up differently is to decenter ourselves when we are in collective process. So decenter our own insecurities, how our being is driven by these insecurities and desires to look good, do good, feel good, move forward. So interrupt that and see what's in front of you. Disarming means understanding that these walls and barriers need to be dissolved so that you can become vulnerable, and that there's strength in vulnerability if you have the vital compass to guide you. And decluttering is decluttering what is preventing and blocking the vital compass from accessing this vitality of life that will give you strength to be well even if you're in pain. And the last thing is discernment, right? So you're not stopping traffic because you want to be seen as the one stopping traffic, but because you're called to do that and you understand that calling. And it's not about getting external validation from others for what you do, but doing what needs to be done. And that's not a big deal, right? So I hope this can inspire you to think about existence in a different way, and the amount of work that we have to do will require some stamina and some resilience so that we can do it together. So I think that's the message that I had for you today, and I hope to be able to answer your questions in our Skype session. Thank you.